is a noble profession. But then when he left the faith, he then repudiated that teaching and took a more pacifist approach and said Christians could not be soldiers. So Tertullian, we can see here, was undergoing a severe kind of crisis of faith, and even maybe a crisis of personhood, of who he was. He began to repudiate some of these things he had mentioned, or he had written about earlier. He joined the Montanists, as I said, and then he broke away from them because they weren't strict enough for him. He wanted them to be more strict, so he broke off and formed his own group. So even here, in the early stages of the church's history, we see, in the 2nd century, second and 3rd century, we see what happens when you break away from the faith, when you break away from the Catholic Church. You form your own, or you join a separate community, but then you don't like what they say. So then you form your own community. And we've seen that throughout, unfortunately, the history of the church, and we'll see it even more so in the 16th century, when the faith in the church is shattered by the Protestant revolt, led by Martin Luther and John Calvin, which we'll talk about in several sessions. But that's the whole, that's just the underlying principle. If we're not united with the Bishop of Rome, we're not united on the rock of St. Peter, then we are at risk of then fracturing and moving off by ourselves into a separate community, and then that community can fracture and separate and so on and so forth. To the point now where today in the modern world, there's over 33,000 different groups of Christians. That's just 33,000 different groups of Christians. It was never part of God's plan. It was not part of what, the prayer that Christ had for us all to be united in one. So it's just a side note as why it's important for us to know our story and know the history of the church, because we will come into contact, or we have, obviously, in our lives, maybe in our own families, people who have left the faith, for many different reasons. And so we need to know the history of our faith, because the history of our faith informs us why we believe what we believe, gives us an ability to answer questions and objections that people have as to the doctrines and teachings that we believe, so we can give them a more full understanding of what it means to be a Catholic Christian. Another writer during this time, living after Tertullian, or living at the same time as Tertullian, but living a little longer than him, was Origen, a man by the name of Origen. Origen was from Egypt, the city of Alexandria. We know an awful lot about Origen because Eusebius of Caesarea, who was the first church historian, he's considered the father of church history because he wrote the history of the church in the 4th century. He gives us a lot of information about Origen and spends a lot of time in his work talking about Origen. Origen's father had suffered martyrdom under the reign of Septimus Severus. Origen was a brilliant student and a brilliant young man. At a very young age, he was placed at the head of the catechetical school in Alexandria. And the catechetical school in Alexandria was a school that was established by the church to instruct catechumens, people who wanted to join the Christian faith. And so Origen was placed at the head of that school. And it was a very important position to occupy, and he occupied it at a very young and early age. He was a great teacher, a prolific writer, was also perhaps one of the first great scripture scholars. He wrote translations of the scriptures, and he also wrote many commentaries on the scriptures. He was eventually ordained a priest, but unfortunately for him, he had a falling out with his local bishop in Alexandria, so he had to flee Egypt and eventually settled in Palestine. And while in Palestine, he made it his work to collect scriptures, copies of the scriptures and copies of classical writings into a large library in Palestine and around Caesarea. He was arrested and tortured under the Decian persecution, which we'll talk about in a second, but lived. He wasn't martyred. Now it's interesting, we refer to Tertullian and refer to Origen. We don't refer to them as Saint Tertullian or Saint Origen, even though their writings are quoted extensively in the Catechism even. The reason why is Tertullian is not known as Saint Tertullian because he left the church and joined the Montanists and then formed his own group. And Origen, because of this issue he had with his local bishop, and also some theological issues that came up later after his death, he was never declared or canonized a saint. So still a revered church father. Again, his writings are quoted in the Catechism, but not a saint. So Decius, the Emperor Decius, comes to the throne, and he begins a persecution of the Christians in the middle of the 3rd century, in the year 249. Now Decius was a very strong man, a good warrior. He wanted unity in the empire. and that there had been some conflict in the empire at this time, and he wanted complete unity in all aspects of imperial life. And for him, that meant that the Christians had to conform to the old gods. He wanted Christians to stop worshiping their God and worship instead the imperial gods to bring about this more close unity that he wanted. So he began one of the first extensive and wide-ranging imperial persecutions of Christians across the empire. He issued his Edict of Persecution in January 250, and that edict said that every man, woman, and child in the empire must make a public sacrifice before the idols of the pagan gods. Every man, woman, and child had to sacrifice the pagan gods by offering up incense to these idols. If you refused to do so, you would be put to death. Now, he started off his persecution by killing the Pope. Tried to go after the leadership. Figured if I went after the head and struck down the head, then the rest of the Christians would just come into line. That didn't happen, but he did martyr Pope Fabian. Now, unfortunately, during this time of persecution under Decius, there was a lot of weakness among the Christians, unfortunately. We have accounts of bishops who actually go into hiding and who refuse to stand up for the faith during this persecution. We have examples or accounts of rich Christians who offered bribes or hired their slaves to fulfill the obligation to sacrifice to the pagan gods. So they in essence gave in by proxy, but still they didn't maintain the faith when called to do so. Now this would cause a problem for the church. These people giving in would cause a problem for the church after the persecution ended. And we'll see this too later with the great persecution under Diocletian. The church is faced with a question of how to deal with these people who gave in. And it's a question I've alluded to and we've talked about through these last several sessions of rigorism. Does the church adopt a policy of rigorism to these people and not let them in or impose harsh and severe penalties? Or does the church practice mercy? How is the church going to deal with this question? And we'll answer that question in a bit. Now also, during this period of persecution, not only do we have the Decian persecution with the Roman Empire, but now we have another schism. We saw the schism with St. Hippolytus in our last session. Now there's another schism that arises in 251. And this is led by the Roman priest Novitian. Novitian was a distinguished theologian, but he had been passed over in voting to replace Pope Fabian, who had been killed under the persecution of Decius. He thought he was going to be made pope. He wasn't made pope. He was upset with that, so his followers elected him pope, elected him an anti-pope. He tried to take over the church by appointing bishops all throughout the known world, all throughout the Mediterranean, all throughout the empire. So he acted as if he was pope, even though he wasn't pope. Again, he belonged to that whole strain of thought of rigorism, where he advocated severe penalties for people who had fallen away and sacrificed to the pagan gods, but then who were contrite later and tried to come back into the church. He eventually was excommunicated by Pope Cornelius, and then he suffered himself martyrdom under the persecution of Valerian. Now Valerian's persecution was from 257 to 259. Valerian at first was friendly to the Christians, but then problems began to arise throughout the empire, and that caused Valerian to use the Christians as a scapegoat once again, to use them as a scapegoat as previous emperors had done. Now the problems for Valerian were that the barbarians were on the move during this period of time. This is a time in the 3rd century, or the middle of the 3rd century, where we have the Franks, who are going to become very important in the history of the church. But the German tribe, the Franks, cross the Rhine and begin to impede upon Roman territory. And they begin to press down on the frontier. So Valerian is dealing with the Franks, he's dealing with these barbarian invaders, it's causing turmoil and unrest in the empire. And also, that's in the west. In the east, the Persians launch an attack against the empire, and so he has to deal with them. The Persians actually go and conquer Antioch and burn it. And so Valerian is under attack on both fronts of the imperial front. So in 257, he issues an edict where he condemns all Christian bishops, priests, and deacons to death. Again, he's trying to draw criticism away from himself, trying to restore unity to the empire, so he uses the Christians as a scapegoat. Now, it's during his persecution, the persecution of Valerian, where we have the famous story of Pope St. Sixtus II and his deacon, St. Lawrence. So the edict went out from Valerian that all bishops, priests, and deacons were to be arrested and executed. And the story goes that the Roman soldiers found Pope Sixtus II in the catacombs saying Mass. And as he was saying Mass, soldiers barged in, they arrested him, dragged him outside of the catacombs, and beheaded him on the spot. And they turned to the deacon who was assisting him in Mass, St. Lawrence, and they gave St. Lawrence a command and told him that he needed to round up the treasure of the church and bring it back to the Romans, or there would be more bloodshed. And so the next day, St. Lawrence appeared before the Roman authorities, and he had with him a group of poor people. And he told the Roman authorities that these people are the treasure of the church. This is why the church is here. This is what the church finds important, is the ministering to those in need. As a result of that, St. Lawrence was convicted of being a Christian and was martyred. And St. Lawrence his sentence of death was to be basically grilled to death on a gridiron, basically on a big barbecue. And the story goes that they laid St. Lawrence on this barbecue, on this gridiron, and that he turned to his persecutor at one point and he said, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side." So they turned him over and then he died. So he again we see this with St. Ignatius, St. Polycarp, all these saints that we see are being martyred horribly by the Romans for the faith, the heroic way in which they meet their death, the heroic way in which they give witness to their faith in Christ, and their love for Him, and their love for the church. And that's what the word martyr actually means in Greek. It means witness. It's to give a witness of your very life for Christ. Now it's interesting, Valerian, when he began this persecution and attacked the church, especially the leadership of the church, he was the first Roman emperor to be captured by Rome's enemies. He was actually captured by the Persians while he was out campaigning against them. He was held prisoner by the Persians for 5 years until his death. During his captivity, Valerian was used as a step stool by the Persian king to mount his horse. So he was humiliated in that way. He had to get down on all fours. The Persian king would step on him, and then step on his back, and then step on to get onto his horse. When Valerian died, the Persian king had him skinned, and then he stuffed his skin with straw and hung up this skin of Valerian in a Persian temple. So the moral of the story is, if you're a Roman emperor, don't mess with the Christians. So we see this happen with many different emperors, but Valerian was the first one who suffered this horrible death at the hands of the Persians. And so we've looked at some of the apologists that have arisen during this period of time to defend the faith against the attacks of the pagans. We've seen the persecutions under Decius and Valerian, and now when we come back from our break, we will see the great persecution that's undertaken by Diocletian that will have a huge impact on the church, and as I said earlier, will leave the church almost in the balance as to whether or not she will continue. So when we come back from our break, we'll pick up our story there. Welcome back. We're continuing our story on the time period persecution. This is our second session of persecution. We just talked about the Valerian persecution and how Valerian met a bad end at the hands of the Persians, and that the moral of the story is, if you're a Roman emperor, to not go around and mess with the Christians, rather to leave them alone. But as we'll see, that lesson that was unfortunately learned by Valerian was not learned by one of his successors, the man Diocletian. Now there's instability in the Roman Empire during this period of time, towards the end of the 3rd century and the beginning of the 4th century. In the 92 years from the death of the Emperor Commodus, he died in 192, to the coming of Diocletian in 284. So in those 92 years, there were no less than 28 Roman emperors. That's of which 22 of those were murdered. So over a 100-year span of time, a little less than 100 years, there were 28 Roman emperors. And of those 28, 22 were murdered. So there was a period of great instability. Men trying to grab the throne for themselves, killing off other men, other emperors, and trying to take it for themselves. So we have just a large amount of instability during this time. That equates to basically a new emperor every 3 years. And for the empire, that was not a good interval. You wanted someone to be in charge of the empire for a lot longer than that. Now Diocletian comes to the throne in 284, and he reigns and lives for a long period of time. So one of his achievements is he brought stability to the empire. And he also changed the administration of the empire, which we'll talk about in a minute. He reigned, as I said, for 21 years. He was a great and able administrator. He recognized that the empire was now just too big for one man to rule. It was just too large for one man to rule, stretching all the way from Spain and Britain all the way down to the Holy Land and all through North Africa. It's just too much of a territory for one person to govern. So he decided upon a great reorganization of the empire. And what he did was he formed what's known in history as the Tetrarchy. The Tetrarchy. And what he did was he basically divided the empire into half. There was a western half of the empire centered in Rome, and then there's an eastern half of the empire. And this east and west half, he then also divvied up even further into smaller regional areas, which he named after himself, dioceses. So if you ever wonder where the Catholic Church gets the name diocese to identify the particular churches, or to say I belong to the Diocese of Arlington or the Diocese of Richmond or whatever, it's from this time period. It's from the end of the 3rd century, from the Emperor Diocletian. When the empire falls and collapses really on itself at the end of the 5th century, which we'll talk about in our next time period, then the church comes into the Western Europe and is the one administrator, the one government, basically, that upholds Western civilization. And by doing so, she adopted these Roman administrative regions called dioceses. So that's where we get the actual name. Now, if you look in your workbook, in your back in the appendix, we have a map of the empire at the time of Diocletian to help illustrate and show in our mind where the empire's dividing line was. So he divided the empire into east and west, and then what he did was he established an Augustus in the west, so an emperor in the west, and an Augustus in the east, or an emperor in the east. So there were, in essence, 2 emperors that ruled their own administrative halves of the empire, and then underneath these Augusti, he appointed Caesars. So you had a Caesar of the west and a Caesar of the east. The idea for that was that when the Augustus in one region, in one half of the empire, died, then his Caesar would take his place. So when the Augustus in the west would die, whoever the Caesar was in the west would then fleet up to become the Augustus of the west. So the reason to do that, obviously, was because of this great instability that we'd seen in the empire for the last 100 years. It was to bring a greater sense of stability to the political administration of the Roman Empire. Now, in the year 303, Diocletian issues an edict of persecution against the Christians. And how this arose was from Galerius, who was the eastern Caesar under Diocletian. So Diocletian was the Augustus in the east, and underneath him was Galerius, who was his Caesar. Now Galerius decided that he wanted to destroy the Christian faith because an issue had erupted in the army over the Christians. There were Christians in the army, and these Christian men began to refuse military service because they had become Christians. And so we had Christian officers and soldiers refusing to offer sacrifice to the pagan gods. And so Galerius wanted to punish them, and so he initiated a small persecution within the army, first of all. Then he was able to bend the ear of Diocletian and get Diocletian to issue an edict of general persecution against Christians throughout the whole empire. And ultimately, Diocletian issued 4 edicts of persecution against the Christians. The first edict he issued ordered the closing of Christian churches and the handing over of the sacred scriptures. So at first it was just, I'll close their buildings and their holy books I'll take from them. That was the first edict of persecution. But that didn't go far enough. Galerius kept pushing his case to Diocletian, so Diocletian then issued another edict. And that second edict was to imprison all of the Christian clergy. So round up all of the priests and bishops and imprison them. That, again, didn't satisfy Galerius. He wanted